So now everything else is going to focus a little bit more on the garden side of things, being outside and what we can do with our landscapes. So reducing emissions as we work in our landscapes. So consider battery-powered equipment or electric lawn equipment, these alternatives to our gas-powered equipment, right? Or go the old-fashioned route. Consider those human-powered tools. So rakes, pruning shears, hand saws, brooms, things like that that require a little bit of elbow grease but help reduce our impact on our environment, right? So also maybe consider some lawn alternatives. So some alternatives to our grass that we can maybe be a little bit more efficient with our nutrient management and just the overall management of our lawn. So finding species that maybe don't require as much mowing and again maybe don't require as much fertilization. Maybe they're a little bit more efficient with their water usage as well, and maybe they don't turn brown in the summer when we get droughty conditions. So plant trees, and I have that with an asterisk. So trees can serve a good purpose. So one example is you can plant deciduous trees around your home, and then as they leaf out in the spring and summer, that'll provide some shade to your home. That'll keep it a little bit cooler as we go through the summer months. But then as we get into fall and winter, those leaves will fall and then allow some light penetration to get onto our house and help warm the house up a little bit in the winter so that our heating and cooling systems can be a little bit more efficient. But I think it's important that we learn the natural history of our area and research what can grow well in your landscape. I think planting with intention is important. So if you're going to plant a tree, let's make sure that we know or have a good idea of what is the purpose of that tree. It can be beautification, that's absolutely fine. But if we're going to plant a tree with the goal in mind of increasing the efficiency of our house, we might have to do a little bit more research to see what trees best suit that purpose. But in some cases, introducing native plants in general might be the better idea than just plant trees. So certainly, like I say, if you have a specific goal in mind, maybe a tree is the route to go. But native plants have spent all their history adapting to our local climate. So they are best suited to succeed in our area. So like I say, this includes trees, grasses, shrubs, our flowers and forbs and sedges. But doing research to get an idea of what those native plants are, what is best suited to your area. Because not every part of Ohio is going to be the same, right? Ohio has a wide range of different ecosystems. So we have things such as like oak savannas, wetlands, shoreline areas, and parts where it was more heavily wooded if you look back in history. But not every place needs to be densely wooded and covered in trees. Our native plants generally are going to require less water and have lower nutrient needs because again they've adapted to the quality of the soils we have here in Ohio. So they're going to be more suited to just tolerating the conditions instead of needing supplemented water and supplemented nutrients. As well, they're going to provide food and shelter to our wildlife species, especially for some of our specialist species like monarchs, that they need that for the caterpillars to feed on. So it is important to make sure that we have some of those species in our landscape to help provide for our specialist species. But there again, do some research and see if we can find those species of plants that provide shelter, food, breeding habitat for a wide range of species. Help us increase that biodiversity, right into our next slide. So again, research, and that helps us to start to understand what can these different plants support and what can our environment help succeed the most. So non-native invasive plants tend to establish monocultures. But even in some cases, natives too can be really aggressive and establish a monoculture. And we start to get this genetic homogeneity, which is not good. So having this biodiversity, a lot of our native plants, it's going to lead to more resilience, to have that genetic variation. So in the face of something like a pest, a disease, you're not going to have a whole population wiped out, right? If you have that genetic variation, there's more likely going to be an individual or a few individuals that are resilient or resistant to that pest or disease and can pass on those stronger genetics. They can also be more resilient in the face of drought or extreme heat. We might also want to consider attracting pollinators and beneficial insects. So this is going to benefit the whole ecosystem, but we can also benefit in our own lawns and gardens, getting these pollinators and beneficial insects to help us with pest control and just to make our gardens and lawns more productive overall. And it might even help us reduce the need to use pesticides. Certainly, you never have to use pesticides, but we definitely have things like our vegetables and some of our flower beds that we want those plants to look more pristine. In some cases, we might consider using pesticides. But if we have these beneficial populations built up, it's going to take longer, or maybe we don't even get to that point where we need to use pesticides. So that's where we get to integrated pest management. And this isn't just within the context of vegetables, this is for our flower beds as well. But using multiple pest management methods to reduce pest populations. We're not eliminating pest populations, we're just reducing them and managing them to a point where the environment and the naturally occurring enemies of these pests can start to work on them for us. So taking advantage of methods, again with the least environmental impact first, and I'll get into an image here that shows that a little bit better here in a second, but then moving our way up, we have a toolbox within integrated pest management of methods we can use in assessing every time we go out and check our plants, what's going to be that next best method of management. And only going to those more impactful, possibly toxic methods if absolutely necessary. Like I say, doing nothing is always option as well, but we might have to consider our plants look like this, which is not ideal. But like I say, we can always do nothing. So here's the IPM pyramid, or kind of more that toolbox of our different management methods. We're really trying to start with prevention, or our cultural controls. The picture's a little bit blurry, so I'll read this off. Some of the examples of cultural controls is our site and plant selection. Are we putting that plant in an area where it's going to succeed, or are we already predisposing it to being vulnerable to diseases and pests? So can we pick a better site or a better plant for a given area? Sanitation, do we have crop residues maybe that we can clean up and reduce the amount of inoculum in the environment that could transmit disease to a crop in a given year or plants in the following year? And crop rotations, again, more on our gardening side. We really want to rotate out of crop families so we're not running into issues with pests and disease, so we don't have to use pesticides to control those. Next up, again, still kind of on prevention, but moving in a little bit into our intervention. Physical and mechanical control, so we have things like pruning, weeding, reducing the environment that's conducive for hosting pests. Things like traps. Traps a lot of times are really just going to help us monitor pest populations, but we can also have trap crops, which can help us detract pests from our cash crops or our desirable crops. Things like barriers and flaming even. Then we get into our biological controls, so our predators, parasites, and nematodes. And actually we have a good example of this here on the last slide. This is a tomato hornworm that has been parasitized by a parasitic wasp, and this is actually the cocoons on the outside of that tomato hornworm. So the wasp lays the eggs inside the worm. They eat the insides of the worm until they're large enough to pupate. They eat their way out of the caterpillar, and the caterpillar is effectively dead at that point, but they eat around the internal organs to let that caterpillar live on as long as possible. But then they spin these cocoons. So if you see that in your gardens, just leave it, because you have a whole new population of parasitic wasps ready to deploy into the landscape and help control these pest species. So that's an example of our biological control, and then we do move into our chemical control. So we do have a little bit lower toxicity, a little bit lower environmental impact with our biorational pesticides, So things like our insecticidal soaps, oils, baking soda, repellents, microbials, and insect growth regulators. And then our conventional pesticides, so our insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. Right?